He was a man who was terrified of public speaking, a man who was so shy that he would run away from social gatherings, a man who was considered a mediocre student, a man who was thrown off a train in South Africa for refusing to move to a third-class compartment, a man who was beaten by a white mob for walking through a wealthy neighborhood. He was a man who was mocked, humiliated, and treated as less than human. And yet, this same man would go on to lead the largest nonviolent resistance movement in human history, to inspire the American civil rights movement, to become the father of a nation, and to prove to the world that the most powerful weapon in the fight against oppression is not violence, but the courage to endure suffering without retaliation. This is the story of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, a man who was not born a great leader, but who became one through a relentless process of self-examination, self-discipline, and an unshakable commitment to the truth. But here is what most people do not realize about Mahatma Gandhi, the man who is remembered as the great soul, the man who taught the world the power of nonviolence, was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who struggled with his own prejudices, a man who was often criticized by his own followers, a man who was not always a good husband or father, a man who was deeply conflicted about his own beliefs. He was a man who was not a saint. He was a man who was constantly striving to become one, a man who was always searching, always questioning, always seeking to improve himself. He was a man who was deeply human, a man who was shaped by his contradictions, and a man whose legacy is both inspiring and deeply complicated. To understand Mahatma Gandhi, you have to go back to the beginning, to the coastal town of Porbandar in the western Indian state of Gujarat, where he was born on October 2nd, 1869, into a world of tradition, religion, and political subjugation. His father, Karamchand Gandhi, was the Diwan, or Prime Minister, of the small princely state of Porbandar, a man of integrity and administrative skill, who served his rulers with loyalty and dedication. His mother, Putlibai, was a deeply religious woman, a devotee of the Hindu god Vishnu, who observed strict religious practices and who instilled in her son a deep sense of moral duty and spiritual discipline. She was a woman who believed in the power of fasting, prayer, and self-purification, and she would teach her son that the most important thing in life was not wealth or power, but the pursuit of truth. Mohandas was the youngest of 3 children, a shy, introverted boy who was often described as ordinary. He was not a brilliant student, but he was a diligent one, a boy who was deeply influenced by his mother's piety and his father's sense of duty. He was married at the age of 13 to Kasturba Makanji, a girl of the same age, in an arranged marriage that was typical of the time. It was a marriage that would last for more than 60 years, a marriage that would be tested by his growing commitment to his principles, a marriage that would be both a source of strength and a source of conflict. In 1888, at the age of 18, Gandhi set sail for England to study law. It was a moment of great excitement and great fear. He was a young man who had never traveled far from home, a young man who was deeply anxious about leaving his family and his culture behind. He was a man who was determined to succeed, a man who was determined to make his mark on the world. He studied law at University College London, a challenging experience that forced him to adapt to a new culture, a new language, and a new way of life. He was a man who was deeply conservative, a man who was not interested in the social whirl of London. He preferred to spend his time reading, writing, and exploring the city's libraries. He was also a man who was beginning to question his own beliefs. He was exposed to the works of the great philosophers and thinkers of the West, and he began to develop his own ideas about justice, morality, and the nature of truth. He passed the bar in 1891, and he returned to India, a qualified lawyer, a man who was ready to begin his career. But he was a man who was also deeply uncertain about his future. The turning point in his life came in 1893 when he accepted a one-year contract to work as a legal advisor for a Muslim trading firm in Natal, South Africa. He was a young man, a newly minted lawyer, a man who was eager to make his fortune. He arrived in South Africa, a land of immense beauty and immense injustice. The British colonial government had imposed a system of racial discrimination that was brutal and dehumanizing. Indians were considered coolies, second-class citizens who were denied the most basic rights. Gandhi was thrown off a train at Pietermaritzburg for refusing to move to a third-class compartment, an experience that would change his life forever. He was a man who had been humiliated, a man who had been treated as less than human. He was a man who had been forced to confront the reality of racism for the first time. He began to organize the Indian community in South Africa, fighting for their rights through petitions, negotiations, and nonviolent protests. He developed a new form of resistance that he called Satyagraha, a word that means truth force or soul force. It was a philosophy of nonviolent resistance that was based on the belief that the moral power of truth could overcome the most powerful forms of oppression. It was a philosophy that would change the course of history. Gandhi spent the next 2 decades in South Africa, building a movement, refining his philosophy, and testing his methods. He was a man who was constantly experimenting, constantly learning, constantly pushing himself to his limits. He established a community called Phoenix Settlement, a cooperative community where he and his followers could live a simple life of work and prayer. He was a man who was deeply committed to the principles of simplicity, self-discipline, and self-sufficiency. He believed that the only way to achieve true freedom was to free oneself from the bonds of desire, from the attachment to material possessions. He began to wear the simple homespun cloth that would become his trademark, a symbol of his rejection of British colonialism and his solidarity with the poor. He was a man who was becoming a leader, a man who was inspiring others to follow his path. He was a man who was not afraid to suffer, a man who was not afraid to go to jail, a man who was not afraid to sacrifice everything for the sake of his principles. In 1915, Gandhi returned to India, a national hero, a man who had fought for the rights of Indians in South Africa and who had emerged as a leader of the Indian diaspora. He was a man who was deeply committed to the cause of Indian independence, but he was also a man who was deeply concerned about the condition of the Indian people. He was a man who was determined to build a movement that would not just challenge British rule, but also transform Indian society. He began to travel throughout the country, visiting villages, talking to farmers, workers, and the untouchables, the lowest castes who were considered to be outside the Hindu social order. He was a man who was deeply committed to the principles of equality and justice, and he was not afraid to challenge the deeply entrenched prejudices of his own society. He called the untouchables Harijans, or Children of God, a radical redefinition of their status that would transform the social landscape of India. He was a man who was building a movement from the bottom up, a movement that would be based on the principles of nonviolence, truth, and the dignity of all people. The next decade was a period of intense political activity. Gandhi led a series of nonviolent campaigns against British rule,
including the non-cooperation movement, the Salt March, and the Quit India movement. The Salt March of 1930 was a defining moment. Gandhi led a march of tens of thousands of Indians to the Arabian Sea, where he collected a handful of salt, a symbolic act of defiance against the British monopoly on salt production. The march was a sensation, a powerful demonstration of the power of nonviolent resistance. It captured the imagination of the world, and it inspired millions of Indians to join the freedom struggle. Gandhi was arrested, as he had been many times before, but his message had been heard. He was a man who had become the symbol of India's struggle for freedom, a man whose name was synonymous with resistance, a man whose methods were being studied and adopted by activists around the world. But Gandhi's life was not without his controversies. He was a man who was often criticized by his own followers for his conservative views, his spiritual obsessions, and his willingness to compromise with the British. He was a man who was deeply committed to the principles of ahimsa, or nonviolence, but he was also a man who was often accused of being unrealistic, of being too focused on the spiritual dimensions of the struggle, of neglecting the practical realities of politics. He was a man who was deeply conflicted about the nature of the Indian identity, a man who was often accused of being too sympathetic to the Muslim community, a man who was deeply committed to the cause of Hindu-Muslim unity. He was a man who was often seen as a saint, but he was also a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was not always a good husband or father, a man who was often demanding and difficult. The partition of India in 1947 was the greatest tragedy of Gandhi's life. He had spent his entire life fighting for a unified India, a country where Hindus and Muslims could live together in peace. But the forces of religious nationalism were too powerful. The British government had decided to divide the country, and India was torn apart by violence. Millions of people were displaced, and hundreds of thousands were killed in the communal violence that followed. Gandhi was devastated. He was a man who had failed to achieve his life's dream. He began to fast, a form of protest that he had used many times before, a way of showing his grief and his determination to end the violence. He was a man who was willing to die for his convictions. He was a man who was determined to make a difference. On January 30, 1948, Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist named Nathuram Godse, a man who believed that Gandhi was too sympathetic to Muslims. He was shot 3 times in the chest as he walked to his prayer meeting in New Delhi. His last words were, "Hey Ram," a Hindu invocation meaning, "O God." He was a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth and justice, and he was killed by the very forces he had fought against. His death was a moment of profound grief for the nation, a moment that shook the world. He was a man who had been killed by the hatred he had tried to overcome. The legacy of Mahatma Gandhi is one of the most profound in human history. He is remembered as the father of the Indian nation, a man who led India to independence through nonviolent resistance. He is celebrated as a symbol of peace, a man whose philosophy of nonviolence has inspired movements for social justice around the world. He has been honored with statues, monuments, and memorials around the world. His name is spoken with reverence, a man who is considered one of the greatest leaders in history. But his legacy is also a story of contradictions. He was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was not always a good husband or father, a man who was often criticized by his own followers. He was a man who was not just a hero, he was a man who was deeply human. a man who was shaped by the prejudices and the weaknesses of his time. Why should someone born today still care about Mahatma Gandhi? Because his life is a testament to the power of the human spirit and the importance of moral courage. He was a man who was not content to accept the world as it was, a man who dared to imagine a better world, a man who was willing to sacrifice everything to make that vision a reality. He showed us that the most powerful weapon in the fight against oppression is not violence, but the courage to endure suffering without retaliation. He showed us that the pursuit of truth is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who believed in the power of the human will, and he was a man who was not afraid to dream. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come.
Gandhi once said, "Be the change that you wish to see in the world." It was a simple statement, but it was a profound declaration of intent. He believed that the only way to change the world was to change yourself, to live your life according to your highest principles, to be an example of the values you want to see in the world. He was a man who was not perfect, a man who was always striving, a man who was constantly seeking to improve himself. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the struggle we endure. He was a man who taught us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was deeply conflicted about his own beliefs, a man who was constantly questioning, constantly searching. He was a man who was not afraid to admit his mistakes, a man who was not afraid to change his mind. He was a man who was not afraid to be wrong, a man who was not afraid to grow. He was a man who was not afraid to be human. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the perfection we achieve, but the progress we make. He was a man who taught us that the pursuit of truth is a journey, not a destination. He was a man who was not just a leader, he was a man who was a teacher, a philosopher, a visionary, and a man whose legacy will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who showed us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence, but love. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the victory we achieve, but the struggle we endure. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero, he was a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten.